Hey everyone, welcome to the Way Champions podcast. This is your host, John O'Sullivan. So excited to be with you today, and so excited for our guest, Dr. Lauren McHenry. Lauren is a certified mental performance consultant through the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. She's a nationally certified counselor. She's a former Team USA and professional athlete, and so she understands the pressures and expectations of athletes from both the athlete perspective, the coach perspective, and the educational perspective as well. She's the founder of McHenry Mental Performance and Thriving Through Being. And so she works with athletes, sports parents, coaches, and organizations across the country, optimizing performance. She created this course, Thriving Through Being, and her business, which is all about the relationship game and winning the relationship game and using her research into elite level performance on developing what she calls unconditional regard, and how that first self-awareness by coaches and then that development of this unconditional regard versus negative or disregard, how important that is. She's also working with former podcast guest Celia Slater and a woman named Tree Beckman through United Soccer Coaches on a college coach credentialing program, teaching these things as well. So in our discussion today, we just have an amazing talk about person-centered coaching, about this idea of unconditional regard and the components of it, and how we can be better coaches for our athletes and better people for our athletes. So I think you're going to truly love this. All right. Now, before we jump in, thank you to our amazing podcast champions on Patreon. If you want to become a supporter of this podcast, go to patreon.com/Way of Champions, and we truly appreciate your support there. Also, want to thank our friends at Sprocket Sports for helping us put out this podcast every week. Go to sprocketsports.com/CTG. Just the best online registration system, communication system, and so much more. Just amazing people there, always working to make the game better. I use it every day, and Sprocket Sports is pretty awesome. So sprocketsports.com/CTG. And then last thing before we jump in with Lauren is if you want to get in a bulk book order for the holidays of either Every Moment Matters or Changing the Game for your parents, or if you want the champion teammate for your athletes, drop me a line, John, JOHN, at changingthegameproject.com, and we can get that ordered up for you here. My experience with shipping and printing is do it early before the holidays, because it starts to get backed up. All right. But for now, just sit back, get ready to go. We're about to dive in with Dr. Lauren McHenry in talking about thriving as a coach so that your athletes can thrive as well. Enjoy. Dr. Lauren McHenry, welcome to the Way of Champions podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you on. You're doing amazing work. We got to have a conversation a month or 2 months ago, just sort of to meet and talk about and get an introduction to it. And we got you on here, and there's so much ground to talk about today. I'm not quite even sure where to start, but I kind of read your introduction and your bio in the intro to the podcast, but just a little bit about, who you are and what you do before we dive in.
Yeah. So I wear a few different hats, all in high performance spaces. One of those hats is as a mental performance consultant, and I'm subcontracted with United States Figure Skating. And so I work with a portion of our Team USA athletes on mental performance consulting, really just one-on-one and team sessions in a discipline that many of you may not have heard of, called synchronized skating. And just helping those athletes kind of understand their thoughts and emotions in the context of sport and performance. And so that's one of the hats I wear. I also wear a hat in the research space, and the majority of my research has been focused on understanding coach-athlete relationships and a lot of aspects about those relationships that are kind of intangible in terms of what cultivates connection and trust between coach and athlete. And so I've published a few articles in that space, and that has really opened the door for me in the world of coach education. So that's kind of the third hat that I wear. And I get to develop and implement and evaluate the effectiveness of coach development programs. One of those being my own program. And also more recently, I've been collaborating on an amazing team with United Soccer Coaches, developing a pilot coach credentialing program for college coaches. Again, kind of focused in on those intangibles of helping coaches understand and make small shifts that I think actually make huge impacts in their way of being with their athletes to improve that connection and trust.
And I love it. And I've gotten to look at your own program, Thriving Through Being, your online course, which is awesome and super helpful. And then I recently listened to United Soccer Coaches podcast with you and Celia Slater and Tree Beckman, sort of talking about this college coach credentialing program that you're doing. But I thought the coolest part about that was after you three went through your program, then they interviewed coaches who had gone through it. And how have you implemented these things? Because, I mean, the world is full of information. It's really about implementation. It's about turning it into action. And who cares what you know if you can't do it? And I think it's one of the hardest things as a coach is to take something, it's hard enough to take something that you see on the field and then replicate it in your practice. But when you start talking about your ability to communicate, to connect, to show love and trust and regard to your athletes, that's even harder to do. And so it was great to hear these coaches talk about the impact that going through your pilot study had on them.
So powerful. Yeah. And I agree with you. It's hard and it's vulnerable to really look at yourself in the way that you're interacting, not just from your own perspective, but to understand that your perspective and kind of your reality in an interaction, for example, between coach and athlete, right? So a coach's reality in an interaction is going to be different than the athlete's reality and how they interpret that interaction. And so it is a brave thing, I think, and a vulnerable thing for coaches to open themselves up to look at how athletes are actually interpreting their interactions, regardless of the coach's intention, right? Coaches are coming in with great intention, and to be able to kind of wrestle with where communication can get lost between intention and impact is a really powerful thing.
And I think that's when we were introduced by your doctoral advisor, right? Dr. Becky Krychek from University of Tennessee. And she said, oh, you have to meet Lauren McHenry and the work that she's doing, because Jerry and I talk about this all the time, winning the relationship game. And what your research and the research of others is really sort of is bringing some just academic proof to, well, what are these things that we call the relationship game, right? And how do you do them? And then how does it work? And I think that vulnerability piece as well is so hard, because sport is still this, macho world of, if I show vulnerability, I'm just being soft, right? I'm not being tough on those athletes. If I show love, if I show care, love and care, it's changing, but those are still words that I think a lot of coaches cringe when they're brought up, of like, that's not me. I'm not soft. We're hard here. We're about winning. And what your research is showing is, no, when you build these relationships and these connections, you'll actually win more, or you'll at least allow your athletes to fulfill their potential. And if they're good enough, then you'll win. And if they don't have the ability, well, there's not much you're going to do about it anyway.
Yeah. And I think I was listening to one of your recent podcasts about kind of the safe sports scaries.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a whole other factor that comes into coaches having fear around showing love and care in our culture today. But I'll back it up and share the framework that guides everything that I do. And that is the person-centered framework, founded by Carl Rogers back in the 1950s. So this framework actually has, over 50 years of research backing it up in parent-child relationships, teacher-student relationships, and counselor-client relationships. But if you read some of Carl Rogers' original works, he really developed this framework for any growth promoting relationship. So any relationship in which the growth and development of a person is the goal. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, that is a coach-athlete relationship as well. Mm-hmm. And so what our work has done with Dr. Becky Zakrajsek at Tennessee is where it all started. And also, I'll just shout out to my master's thesis advisor, Dr. Jeff Cochran, who is in more of the counseling space, but really grounded in the person-centered framework. We were just the first to take this framework and try to actually empirically understand what it could look like or how it could apply in the coach-athlete context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead. Did I interrupt there?
No, all good.
Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to be who you're teaching, and interrupting is not a good quality of mine. So, all right. So, so maybe let's kind of talk about, we can start with this coach credentialing course. And again, your pilot was, I believe it was through United Soccer Coaches and it was just soccer coaches on the collegiate level. And now sort of year one, you're opening up to other sports as well. Correct? Am I correct in that, in saying that? Yeah. And so what are you teaching in this course? It's a year long, it's a couple hours a week. This is a deep dive into the connection and the relationship side of things.
Mm-hmm. Can I actually backtrack? And
you're the guest. Hit pause, hit play, do whatever you want. Yeah. Like whatever. Yeah. You know what you want to talk about. So let's do that. Okay.
So I'm going to add a little bit about the framework and then.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Great. Awesome.
Yeah. So within the person-centered framework, what it suggests is that 3 things are necessary within any growth promoting relationship to actually create change.
Yeah.
First thing is authenticity. And that's something that I love about this framework, because it means that it's not a one size fits all approach and it's not a cookie cutter approach. Mm-hmm. It actually requires authenticity, and it requires that that skill that you were talking about earlier of taking knowledge mm-hmm. and turning it into action in an mm-hmm. authentic way. Mm-hmm. So authenticity is number 1. Number 2 is empathy. And I have really started to use Brené Brown's more recent definition of empathy, which is hearing someone else's perspective and story and believing them, right? Not necessarily suggesting that we can put ourselves in every other person's experience's shoes, because that's not always possible, but we can hear someone's experience and believe that their experience is real to them. Mm. And so that's how we've started to really teach empathy. And the third is unconditional regard. And this is probably the closest thing to what you're calling, and just speaking Jerry Lynch's language, is love. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not in a romantic sense, but in a sense of being able to hold someone in a really high regard. And what we did in our research is we interviewed retired elite level athletes about their relationships with former coaches, and wanted to specifically understand, what does unconditional regard even look like in a high performance context,
Mm-hmm.
where there have to be standards and
Mm-hmm.
expectations,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because being a former athlete myself, I was really being a little bit skeptical about this concept when I first learned about it, and was kind of like, what, unconditional what? And but I also kind of saw it as something that I needed for myself,
Mm-hmm.
and that could be really useful in sport performance spaces, to be able to have kind of this underlying knowing that I'm okay no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And so, put very simply, that is what unconditional regard is. And in context of coach to athlete, it's the athletes knowing that coach is going to be there for me no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The way that came out within our qualitative research, we really were able to come up with a 5-part definition for unconditional regard. And that is the athlete's experience of feeling accepted, respected, engaged with, believed in, and challenged in failure as much as in success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is awesome, and I'm so glad you backed us up. And to break this down first, I think it makes much more sense before we talk about your courses. And so, I mean, this idea of, coaching the person and not the sport is one of the basic concepts that we talk about all the time. And number one, being authentic, being yourself. I think that's a huge thing. You should never try to be the second best Steve Kerr. Like, be the best you, right? Take what you can from a Steve Kerr. I mean, I think one of the challenges with authenticity is oftentimes we coach like we were coached, right? And so that might be my authentic self, and it might not be a very healthy or helpful one. And so this importance of self-awareness and diving into, well, am I being the most effective coach I can be if I'm my authentic self and I coach that way because that's how I was coached? But is that really the best way to do it? And so maybe just talk about that for a bit. And I want to break down, especially this unconditional regard. What we're going to dive deeper into that for sure.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think it requires self-awareness to understand who you are, and in order to be who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we also get tripped up sometimes with that in a lot of coaches were former athletes, and there's a lot of different reasons why people come back into their sport to coach. Maybe it's because their kids are involved in it. Maybe it's a volunteer thing, but maybe it's actually a real career aspiration, null kind of path for them. And maybe there's things, I think we can get tripped up sometimes when there's things we want to prove, that could be left over from our own athletic experiences. And so that in combination with not having a lot of training opportunities out there for coaches to learn
In this space. Yeah. There's lots of training. Go learn a new offense, a new defense, new technique.
Yeah.
Like that's a dime a dozen. It's this type of training that's harder to find.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the training in, even at the most basic level, why self-awareness is important in coaching, why it's important to be authentic in coaching. So yeah, the hard part is that takes time and kind of investing in yourself to really understand yourself and kind of create your own way as a coach. But the fun part about that is that you get to create your own way. And something that I often tell coaches, and this is embedded within the online course I have, is, to kind of think about every person who comes into a sport has something to bring to that sport that nobody else could bring, because nobody else is that person.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that person is not going to be the next All-American, or maybe they're not going to end up in Division I athletics or on track to the Olympics. But for coaches to kind of take a step back and look at, what could this kid bring to this sport
Mm-hmm.
that could add value to this sport, that could expand the sport, that could grow, in terms of their effort or their character or just who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And then I back it up a step from that for coaches to think about themselves, right? No two coaches are going to be alike, because no other coach is you.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to recognize that within yourself as a coach,
Mm-hmm.
that you are the only person that can bring what you have to bring to this sport. And so finding what that is, believing that in yourself, and really capitalizing on that, I think is a really powerful way to bring authenticity to coaching.
Yeah. Amen. Amen to that. So what we might call love, and you're calling unconditional regard, and right, this idea, I think you said before, the coach is there for me no matter what, right? I think that's what every athlete wants to feel, that the coach is in this for my best interest, because coaching's hard. And especially, right, you're working with college coaches on that level, right? If I coach a college soccer team, and I have 26 people on my roster, 11 of them are happy and 15 are pissed off at me every single game, right? And so the challenge is sometimes less with those ones who are playing all the time, but it's everyone on your roster. How do I validate them? How do I make them feel like they have a role and they're playing an important part, if I cannot reward them with playing time, right? So it's this idea of, everyone wants playing time and recognition, right? And if I can't give playing time, I better be pretty darn good at recognition.
Yeah, playing time at the root of so much coach-athlete conflict.
Right.
And it is really hard to do this when you are also the decision maker on selections for playing in the game, selections for who's on the team each year, selections for who's on the bus, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I come back to our definition, and what we found is that the definition that came out of our research for unconditional regard is proving to be a very useful definition to coaches, because you have to have standards and expectations around playing time, right? A coach's job big portion of their job is to win games. And there has to be standards, there has to be expectations around that. And that's not a bad thing.
Right.
It's also not bad coaching to select players to play in the game. That's part of your job.
Yeah. This is the terms and conditions. Like, yeah.
Yeah. It's required, right?
Yeah.
And so, but if we can think about the 5 components of regard: acceptance, respect, engagement, belief, and challenge. Can you do those things as much as possible? Mm-hmm. Can you hold acceptance, respect, engagement, belief, and challenge while you're telling a player you're not going to play today?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it sounds simple. It's harder to do in practice and in reality. But I think even having that language and thinking about it in terms of unconditionality around those 5 components mm-hmm. makes it more tangible. It makes it doable, even as you're having the tough conversations that you have to have. In fact, I think coaches who have gone through our programming and learned this framework have been able to have hard conversations more often,
Mm-hmm.
because part of respect and engagement is being honest with your players.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 100%. I listened to a while back an interview with the former professional golfer and then Ryder Cup coach, Paul McGinley. And he talked about when he was the Ryder Cup coach, the advice he got was don't give players bad news without some good news as well. Right. And he was talking about, like, in the Ryder Cup, having to tell, a world-class golfer, you're not going to play in these doubles matches, right? You're not going to do this. He said, but you're going to be our first singles player on Sunday. You're going to lead us out of the gate, So give you this. And what did how can I throw you a bone? And I think that's this idea of these 5 components is super. This is what it is, right? That even if I'm disappointed that I'm not playing, if I know that coach still believes in me, right? And listen, you have a senior in front of you. She's an All-American, right? You get to play against her in practice every day. No one gets a better practice environment in the whole country than you, because you're playing against one of the best players in the country, right? And that's how I see you getting to that next level next year, right? So I see you, I care about you, I respect you, I know how it makes you feel, and then I challenge you, right? And so what I want you to do is really go and stretch her and make her better and make yourself better, right? Like that. As an athlete, like, okay, I get it, right? I get it. And that's
Right.
what I want to do. So talk about that. And then I want to actually talk about this idea of, we're talking about elite performers, but I would think how we show unconditional regard for the recreational performer might be slightly different. Maybe you disagree.
Yeah, I think it's critically important, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the challenge piece, and it's allowing space for an athlete to develop, right? Because and part of this too is really being generous in your assumptions of your athletes. I think that's can be hard to do with this generation of athletes as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really quick to make assumptions about someone's character, about their work ethic, about whether they care or not, how much they're trying, kind of based on performance outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And I say performance outcomes really meaning like how they're showing up in training
Mm-hmm.
every day. And we can be really quick to jump to assumptions about that. And so a way to shift that is to be really generous in assumptions, and recognize, like, part of our natural human tendency is wanting to strive.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we're all trying to balance these kind of competing needs of needing to belong and feel accepted just as how we are, and needing to strive and pursue and kind of constantly better ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Those two things sometimes feel like they're competing against each other.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can kind of put those in the same space,
Mm-hmm.
accept who and where you are right now, and strive for more, both of those things can be true.
Mm-hmm.
Both
Mm-hmm.
of those things are actually, like, fundamental. If we think about our psychological needs, we have a psychological need for relatedness, and that's strongly tied for our need for love and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then we also have the psychological need for competence and autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's striving and wanting to feel like we're competent and capable of doing challenging tasks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so recognizing that that's part of human nature, right? So maybe we could make the assumption that athletes really do want to challenge themselves. They really want to be in challenging environments. They just also have this need to feel capable of meeting the demands in front of them. And so I think part of the creative challenge in coaching is constantly increasing those demands to promote development while also helping athletes feel capable of pushing themselves that much further.
Right. We want stretch, but it can't be so challenging that we can't do it and get discouraged, and it can't be so easy that we get bored. But when we're right at that edge, that's when we get flow, and that's when we get all these sort of things. And that's the art. I mean, you talk in your course about the difference between the art of coaching and the skill of coaching, and I think that all fits into that. Maybe we'll get to that later. But yeah.
Yeah.
So talk about like, right. What I was talking about with different levels of performer, because we have listeners here who are coaching professional sports or collegiate sports. And so let's just lump those into elite level performers. And then we have people who are working on grassroots. And I was just thinking about, we had Ashley Merriman on a couple months back, who's a science writer, and she was talking about she's doing a lot of research on feedback, and how the research on feedback, it shows that, if someone is an expert performer, they want really clear, concise, quick feedback, right? Like, don't butter it up for me. Just tell me what I need to do, versus someone who's new to learning thing, whether they're a junior or whatever, they need a little more encouragement with it or whatever, And so I would think that sort of coaches in it for me, no matter what, sometimes looks different if I'm coaching an 18-year-old or an 8-year-old.
Yes. And what we have found is athletes' experiences as an 8-year-old, really in that's developmental time, 8 through 12, 13 years old, really shapes how they come to understand what a coach is.
Mm.
And so an athlete who experiences an opposite of unconditional regard, which we found in our research would be conditional regard, right? Acceptance, respect, engagement, belief, and challenge only if I'm performing, looking, behaving a certain way. Disregard, coach is just paying attention to everyone else. Negative regard, putting down, belittling, shaming. When athletes experience those things earlier in their sport journey, that shapes how they interpret coach interactions later on.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to be more likely to interpret a communication from a coach who may be doing everything they can to show regard to this athlete. They're going to be more likely to interpret it in negative ways or as disregard because
Based on how they were coached early on.
Experiences. Yeah.
And that to me is scary.
Yeah.
Number one, as a coach, recognizing that my influence is not just, whether they quit or not, but the way that I show them this regard keeps them, shapes how they'll see coaching for the rest of their career. Like, number one, that's a very scary thing, because that's a massive amount of responsibility. And number two, systemically, it's a scary thing, because the people who are coaching at those vulnerable ages are often our least trained coaches. Right. So that's it. And I think about this a lot, because I do coach 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds. Right. And I think about how the way that they might receive some feedback, or how they respond to a coach trying to create a standard, which for 8-year-olds is, when the coach is talking, you're listening, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, don't punch the kid next to you, right? Like, whatever these things are, that's not okay. And you just see some of them that critique of them, just you just see their whole demeanor change, and that's coming from probably how they're treated at home and how that behavior is treated at home. And that's the challenge of grassroots coaching right there, is you're shaping behavior, and that behavior is often shaped by the parents, and what's allowable and what's not allowable. And that's a big question, but it's probably worth talking about, because this is a challenge for me personally. So this can be the John O'Sullivan work session here. Like, how do I find that balance between upholding what I believe is an important standard, because I'm teaching you how to learn how to practice. I'm also trying to help you enjoy the game, but we need certain behavioral standards in order to do that.
Good question. And I'm going to throw it back to you with a question of just.
That's so Irish of you.
That was in my roots. I'm going to throw it back. Yeah. Well, I just want to understand how you are already trying to do that, and what's worked for you and what hasn't worked.
You mean establish behavioral standards?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So lay them out, right? State what they are. Do your best to enforce them. Call out unacceptable behavior, sometimes individually pulling a kid aside. Sometimes, when 10 people are talking and you're calling in the group, you gotta call it out within the group. I don't believe in exercise as punishment, right? I think you should love running, and so running shouldn't be seen as something to avoid. So usually, when the behavior won't stop, it's something like, just go sit down for 5 minutes, because you're disrupting what I'm trying to teach everyone else. And then it was interesting. So for this group of kids that we did this past month, we did bingo. And we had 25 bingo board items. And some of them were like, learn a new skill, juggle the ball a couple times a week, do push-ups. And a lot of them were life skills, like write a thank you note to a teacher, make your bed. The hardest thing for kids is to make their bed 7 days in a row, believe it or not. That's what I've found.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah. Learn to bake cookies, take out the garbage without being asked. So we're doing human development and soccer development at the same time. But for this particular group, we have about 40 to 50 kids. Just the listening, and this is something I've seen since COVID, the ability to sort of listen in a group situation. We added a bingo thing of like, don't be removed from practice for not listening. And so the little carrot out there, it changed the behavior. Like it would, the coaches were like, there was a noticeable difference in their being quiet or getting their teammates to be quiet. And that it was noticeable, which is really interesting.
That's fascinating. And, and very cool to kind of gamify it for them.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a great example of kind of meeting them where they are developmentally.
Yeah.
At 8 years old. And I'm curious how you communicated this to the parents as well, if you did.
Yes, no, 100%, because they're 8, and right. And so we talk about, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. Right. And I mean, we send the bingo board, we hand it out in practice. Right. So we print it out, but we also send it to the parents. And like, so when your child loses this, like, here you go. So you can print out another one, because they will lose it. Right. And they come back, like, it was actually last night was the bingo finale. And so any kid who finished all 25 squares got a prize last night, which was super cool. Right. So we had some club scarves and some t-shirts and stuff. And then kids who did 20 got stickers and things like that. So we rewarded them for trying to do most of these things. But what was super interesting was, like, we said to the parents, and so I got this idea from a friend named Mark Spiegel, and he was a coach that I used to mentor, and he's just an amazing youth coach. Got to give him the shout out. And so he did this, and I did this first last spring, and it was such amazing thing. And so, we talk philosophically to the parents that this is about human development, right? Soccer is just a vehicle. Mm-hmm. We want your kids to be better people. Now, I don't think any parents go, no, don't do that to my kid, just teach soccer. Right. So parents love this. And what's awesome is the first time we did it, like immediately, like parents were sending me pictures of their kid taking out the garbage and like, can we do this every month? Like, this is awesome. right? So I think, we encourage them, have conversations. Why is it important to write a thank you note to a teacher, right? Why is it important to take out the trash without being asked? Why is it important, to spend a day without screens, things like that? And so, yeah, I mean, at that age, parent engagement is the key to it all.
That's why I asked. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think that communication, that proactive communication with parents, as well as your communication with athletes at that age is so important. And you're exactly right that the foundation of how kids learn to view themselves is based on their home life experiences first and foremost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a really interesting finding from our research is that athletes' experiences of unconditional regard, or the opposites from their coaches, actually informed how they started to regard themselves over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they experienced unconditional regard from a coach, they were more likely to regard themselves unconditionally as an athlete in the context of their sport.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The opposite was also true. What we found was that this served as a buffer for athletes who had more conditional regard, negative regard, or disregard at home,
Mm-hmm.
which just
Oh,
speaks
wow.
to
So that's
how,
interesting.
that
Yeah.
coaches have.
Yeah. And I think that's why many kids who come from a tough home life will point to a coach or a teacher,
Totally.
right? And say, thank God for, Miss McHenry. Thank God for Mr. O'Sullivan. He got me through because my life was a mess, right? When you do that the right way.
Yeah. And when coaches can partner with parents, as opposed to just kind of buying into the frustrations of parents, I think when we can really look at that as a potential partnership, that's where we can start to have more of the best of both worlds, where there's more consistent regard in both settings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so one exercise we use to help coaches with that is, I just call it roles and responsibilities. And it would be a reflective exercise for coaches to just write down for themselves, what are the roles and responsibilities of the coach?
Mm-hmm.
And we can think about this at the level that you're coaching at with 8-year-olds, right? What are your roles and responsibilities really at that age and at that competitive level?
Yes.
Then
Herding squirrels. Like, yeah.
yeah. But also developing life skills, which is what you're doing, right?
Exactly.
And engaging them in hopefully lifelong enjoyment in this game, right? Kind of promoting physical activity, all of those things. And it's okay to have performance aspects of that, right? It's okay for coaches to want to help athletes become better soccer players or whatever the sport is. But getting really clear on what are the roles and responsibilities of the coach, then get really clear on, from your vantage point, what are the roles and responsibilities of the parents and what are the roles and responsibilities of the athletes, and kind of doing your due diligence to make sure those roles and responsibilities you're placing on the athletes are developmentally appropriate as much as possible.
Yeah.
And what that does is it just gives you language to be able to communicate to your parents. These are the roles and responsibilities of the parents in our program. This is how, we need you. We need your help. This is how you can really partner with us to help your kids develop optimally.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, because I think that the question that pops to mind is, everyone listening, like, we all get this. And I know, and in your course, you talk about some of the, coaches who are like, but I'm doing this and the way it's being perceived is not right. So, what, if I'm doing all the things to show unconditional regard and the perception of the athlete is that I'm screwing them over or whatever. And that perception is shaped by their upbringing, their previous coaching, their parents, their peers, whatever, right? Like, what do I do in that situation? Like, because that's the challenge, right? Like, I'm doing all these things and I'm still not getting through, or this person is still not buying in, because of maybe who they are more so than who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really tough. But I think creating spaces and a sense of safety in those spaces for coaches to proactively seek feedback from their athletes can be really impactful here, because you're not actually going to know how your communication is landing on the athlete without asking to kind of confirm. And also creating an environment and a space where athletes feel safe to be honest in giving feedback back to the coach. And I think at the younger levels and ages, there can be places and spaces for seeking feedback from parents. What are your kids saying about practice in the car ride home? How are they talking about their sport outside of the time that they're in practice, right? So there are ways to seek that feedback. And I think coaches are so used to giving feedback, and also that's the way most of us in this generation were coached, is predominantly a one-way direction of coach giving the athlete feedback.
Right.
And it's kind of funny that the older we get, the less comfortable we get with taking feedback and asking for it. And I think that is really the way to get to a place of shared understanding with an athlete about the coach's intentions and how and what's going on for the athlete that is leading them to interpret something differently than how the coach has intended it. The other thing I would add to that is I think we often forget to actually say what our intentions are.
Okay.
Really simple, but to actually put to words, here's my intention in communicating this to you. And that's where the language of the definition of regard can be helpful too, because there can be intention in, I want you to know that I believe in your capability to receive this feedback and do something with it.
Yeah. I'm telling you this because I believe in you. And I know there's a lot of research around, if you preface your feedback with that, the uptake and the improved performance is significant. So that's exactly what you're saying right there. Yeah. Oh shoot. Like I was thinking about this, of all the coaches we've had on this podcast, and you and I might have talked about this last time we were on the phone together. The one thing, especially the collegiate coaches and the professional coaches say, if you're like, hey, what was your most effective coaching tool? What do you wish you did more of? They all say one-on-one meetings. Individual meetings is really where that's where the coaching happens. Because I think that's where you're building all these things. That's where you're showing acceptance and belief and respect and all that sort of stuff. And the importance of that, not just being a basketball meeting or a soccer meeting, but a meeting about, right, how are you doing? How are you doing? Right? Like what's the most important thing? I think this was Becky Burley, Celia Slater's, partner, said to us, she always began the meeting, what's the most important thing we can talk about today?
Yeah.
Right. Like that sort of thing, it builds this stuff. And then I think we also, as the coach, when we open ourselves up to give me feedback, balance that with, when I think of some of my best coaches or best teacher, my feedback in the moment might not have been super positive, but the ones I'm most grateful for, the ones who truly challenged me and held me to a higher standard, I appreciated later. a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later. And so recognizing that sometimes what comes back is not a great indicator of the impact that you're having.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to take it personally.
Yeah, exactly. Don't take it personally.
When it's negative. Yeah, I think grounding, I mean, there are actual strategies to prepare yourself to receive feedback. And a couple of those things are just grounding yourself in your values and what you know to be kind of your truth and what your why is in coaching, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
Grounding yourself in that, reminding yourself of your strengths, and really committing to like setting an intention and committing to understanding the truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that truth is just information, and it's information that you can use.
Yeah. I love this part in your online course about identifying triggers to maintaining regard for athletes, like this self-awareness piece, because what are the things that happen that tend to make me do things that I really don't want to do? What are the things that make me react and not respond? Can you just talk about that for a second? Because I think having an itinerary or a list of those triggers and when are the moments they come up and how can I respond better is a really important part of the coaching toolkit.
Definitely. Yeah. So this is another kind of self-reflection exercise to think about athlete behaviors or sports situations that you love, and athlete behaviors or sports situations that irritate you. And I want to give a shout out to a friend of mine, Shantiana Keys, who was a former manager of education at the Women's Basketball Coaches Association. And she reviewed a lot of our content when we were building this with women's basketball staffs.
Mm-hmm.
And we originally had in there like a list of behaviors that you hate. And she made that suggestion to switch it to irritate.
Irritate. Yeah.
It's not because the behaviors we hate are obvious, right? The ones that irritate us, sometimes it takes going through this exercise multiple times, and then before we really realize and admit, oh, this is something that I'm not supposed to be upset about, but I am,
Mm-hmm.
right? When a kid shows up 5 minutes late, right? That's really irritating. And I'm supposed to give them grace or whatever. But so I think it helps us be a little more honest with that. And then putting that list in front of you or on paper, the next step would be to look at each of those behaviors or situations and reflect on your automatic reaction.
Mm-hmm. How
might you automatically react? And using the language of unconditional regard or the opposites, right? Is this reacting in a way that would communicate regard, positive regard, negative regard, or disregard?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second piece to this exercise, which I understand is a really big ask of coaches, and it's not an easy thing to do, but I will say the coaches that have done this and committed have had such profound insights from it, is to actually give this list of situations and behaviors to either members of their staff or to their athletes, and have their staff and their athletes go through each behavior and share how they experience that coach's reactions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So then you can actually look at your perception of it compared to their perception of it and see where there might be misalignment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's an incredible thing to do. That what would they call it in the business, a 360 analysis, like get feedback from all sides, your assistants, your whatever. I mean, I did some coach mentoring, a guy named Mark Bennett from the UK. mentored me, and I put a GoPro on my chest and film practice, and just, and it's really interesting to watch yourself coach and hear, because you forget about the camera soon enough. And I remember the first practice I did with Mark, it was so bad. It was so bad. The focus, the behaviors, the competitiveness of this practice. And this is my daughter's team. They're probably 14, right? 13-year-old girls. It was so bad I ended practice early, right? I was just like, I can't do this. And then I wasn't going to send it to him. And he's like, no, you have to send it. Like, there'll be way more learning opportunities. But then in reviewing it, I actually saw that, no, it wasn't everyone. It was two kids that were sort of dragging the group down. And if I had been more specific about dealing with their behaviors, the rest of the group was doing fine. And it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And there were so many opportunities for me to do something better, and I didn't. It was really impactful to just, and any coach can put a GoPro on your chest and film yourself coaching, and just look for these moments and identify what are the triggers, right? Because I know what my triggers are. And when they happen, I go from, Jekyll to Hyde very quickly.
Yeah. And you know what that does is it really puts the power back in your hands. It puts
Yeah.
the power back in the hands of the coach, because you're making the decision to film yourself and review it and reflect on it and learn from it. What's happening in our culture right now is we have, what's it called? Live Barn.
Okay.
Right?
I don't even know what that is.
This is in a lot of ice rinks. Live Barn
Okay.
is
Oh,
cameras,
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
right? And parents can log in and see everything that's happening at the rink, right? So we have that happening. We have in college athletics, student athletes know exactly how to go to their administrators to make a complaint about a coach, right? So there's this feeling of it's the athletes that have all the power right now. It's the parents that have all the power right now, and coaches are being just watched all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're explaining of having a coach put a GoPro on their hat or whatever and making the choice to film themselves, to review it, to become better, that's an example of turning the tables and kind of taking the power back for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're reflecting on yourself proactively,
Mm-hmm.
rather than worrying about other people watching you and filing a safe sport report or making a complaint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, as we talked about with Matt Kaiser about the safe sport stuff, I mean, there's lots of college coaches now I know who won't hold a one-on-one meeting, right? Who won't do a meeting without recording it, who won't, you know, not record every practice. And it's more of a, cover your arse type thing. Like they just don't want to put themselves in those situations. And, I think, there's some pushback. There's some great athletic administrations that are like, we have the backs of our coaches, but realistically, this is where winning comes in. If you're winning, you can get away with more. And if you're losing, this is just a great way to fire you. And so after a bad season, if you go 16-2 and some athletes go and complain, you're far more likely to keep your job than if you go 5-10. Right. And regardless of if you coach the same way and you did well the year before. And so this is the challenge that, coaches oftentimes know what the problem is. And sometimes, especially college coaches, like, you know what, they're a senior. I got 4 games to go. Let me just get them out. Right. And then that kid goes in and does an exit interview. And next thing you know, the college coach loses his job or loses her job. Right. And it's just like, they were always the problem, but no one asked me. No one interviewed me in this situation, So, I mean, it's a hard thing. It's really hard to coach right now.
It is. And that's where I think kind of really take taking steps to build your self-awareness is taking that power back.
Yeah. Amen. And then coaching this way, which I also think is more rewarding, right? That I'm reaching people, right? That this is, I'm giving them a good human experience that they want to be a part of, and that we do things differently here is so important. And that's why I'm so glad. I mean, again, you're doing this college, coach credentialing, and through United Soccer Coaches, and that the NCAA is getting on board with this, because again, we hire coaches because of their background in the sport and the X's and O's. But like when we hire a teacher in a school, he or she usually gets a mentor, right? Someone to walk them through and like teach them this. In coaching, we don't do that. We're just like, oh, well, you played, and you took these coaching courses, so you're good. And so I think this type of mandatory coaching education eventually, right, that I'm going to get credentialed in how to connect, how to communicate, how to whatever, it makes every coach better. It will make every coach better.
That's the hope. And it's not mandatory yet. But I just sat on or engaged in a call that was facilitated by the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And they brought representatives of every coaches association of college sports into the space. And it was the first time that the Knight Commission had facilitated something like this, of bringing the different sports coaches associations together. But that was definitely a topic of conversation, is really putting in front of the NCAA the value and potential impact of mandating some type of credential for college coaches to have. And the work we've been doing, and it's not just me, this started within the Women's Basketball Coaches Association, and now United Soccer Coaches has kind of taken the torch. There's also work being done in a lot of different academic spaces as well, and in coaching science, of what are the competencies that are necessary to be effective in coaching in any sport,
mm-hmm.
and kind of defining those competencies. So we could consider the possibility of pooling resources across sports to have really excellent programming and helping coaches develop these competencies. And then, of course, they're going to specialize in their sport-specific issues.
Right.
But we really feel strongly, and through my research and others, that those commonalities across coaching comes down to culture. And if it's a team sport, yes, your team culture, but that's not specific to team sports. There's a culture in individual sport environments.
Mm-hmm.
So the culture of your program, then the one-on-one relational skills, and then kind of honing in onto that self-leadership, how you know yourself, your self-awareness, and how you lead yourself as an example for your athletes. And those are the things that we're really honing in on with the college coach credentialing program with United Soccer Coaches.
Yeah. And I think all these things are so hugely important for so many reasons. One of which is just you're going to reach more people. You're never going to get everyone, but you're going to reach more. And this idea that these are important competencies for me to develop as a coach, because I think sometimes these, if we lump them into the soft skills, which I don't think anyone likes that definition, right, or that word, but if we lump them in, a lot of people don't look at them as skills, because a skill is something that can be developed. They look at them as have or have nots, right? They look at these ideas as like with this fixed mindset of, well, that's just not me. I'm not a good listener, or I'm not good at the one-on-one stuff, the relationship stuff, as if that's not something I can improve. And what we know is that, no, if it's a skill, it can be improved. So it doesn't mean you're going to be as great as someone else, but you can be better at it than you are today. And if you get better at it, it's important. And I think, one of the things that we've always missed in this country, because we don't have a national coaching governing body, right? We've
Right.
got 54 or whatever it is, Olympic sport governing bodies, is that, coaching, in a room, I like rooms that are mixed, right? Where here's the volleyball coach and the football coach and the soccer coach and the basketball coach, because it takes away the ego of who knows more about their sport, right? And then we can meet in the middle, everything we've just talked about the last hour, because I think that's coaching, right?
Yeah.
The other stuff is training and skill development and skill, but the coaching is all this relational stuff and the ability to meet in the middle, because I can learn a lot from the volleyball coach and I can learn a lot from the hockey coach and I can learn a lot. How do you reach this person? How have you dealt with this situation? And so by not having a national coaching governing body,
Mhm.
everything gets farmed out to each sport. And therefore it becomes all about the X's and O's and not about coaching. And so I'm so happy the work that you all are doing and United Soccer Coaches is doing to sort of pull this back. And I think your first round of testimonials is only going to get bigger of people saying, this changed how I coached. And it really helped me. It's more rewarding. It's better. And I've become better for it. What I have found in teaching this in the own way that Jerry and I have done it as well, and running 7 years of conferences, is that sometimes like people go through this and they have this incredibly impactful emotional experience. And sometimes they're like, I'm getting out of coaching. It makes them realize like their calling is not exactly what they're doing in that moment.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not just happened once, it's happened a couple of times where someone's like, you know what, that impacted me so much. And I realize, I want to work with more than just a team of kids. I want to be in part of this program or that. And so it's been really cool.
Yeah. And ultimately, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're not really authentically in it, and if you're not passionate about it, there's a lot of potential to do harm in coaching,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yes. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. And I think of the medical adage, first do no harm. Like it's a good place to start, right?
Yeah.
Look, we're at the end of our time. Lauren, can you tell people the best way to get a hold of you, your website, your online course, and then also where they can find this United Soccer Coaches course as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd love to direct anyone who is a college coach of any sport. And we understand time constraints depending on where you are in your season. And so this timing may be the best for fall sports. We're in process of working on different kind of timings and pacings of offering this at different times of year. So I just want to just acknowledge that. But any college coach, there's also no good time in college athletics. So
Right. You're
why
never
not
not
any
busy.
time, right?
Yeah. Christmas Day.
Exactly. Why not any time? So I'd love to direct you to unitedsoccercoaches.org /college-coach-credentialing, and we can link that in the show notes. Check out the College Coach Credentialing course or program. It's very comprehensive. It does ask a lot of our coaches. There's a 2-day in-person programming kickoff that'll happen at the beginning of the United Soccer Coaches Convention in Anaheim, California. That's January 9 and 10. But we'll actually be starting on Zoom with the upcoming cohort before then in December. And the requirement would be the investment would be about 2 hours per week. But those 2 hours are really designed to fill you up and be part of your planning for what you're doing with your team in that time. Be part of your they're really designed to be energizing for you. And so check that out. Really consider it. I think a challenge we face is just there's not a big culture around investing in yourself as a coach. And that's something we're really trying to shift and change, and help coaches see that the more you invest in yourself, yes, you're giving time and money, but the return on that investment is so great. And if that's something you can really model for your student athletes, to invest in yourself, because I don't know any coach who would say that they don't want their student athletes to invest in themselves and put in the extra 2 hours per week on their own training, right? So that program has been, you can listen to the podcast on coach credentialing on the United Soccer Coaches podcast and hear directly from the coaches. It's been life-changing for those coaches. And it's also created a community that, they've told us they've got lifelong friends that they didn't have before going through this program. So really proud of that. And I'll also will direct any coach, any level, to McHenryMentalPerformance.com. You can head over to the coaches tab or the course tab and check out my online course, Thriving Through Being, which is a deep dive into this concept, unconditional regard. This course was designed as part of my PhD dissertation. So we designed it, facilitated it, and evaluated it with 17 women's basketball coaching staffs across the US. And I'm a big believer in building bridges between research and practice. And so I'm continuing to make sure that we have ongoing evaluation efforts, and that the things we're putting out there are really evidence-based, but at the same time, actually useful. That's the goal.
I love this, and I'll just give it the shout out. You sent me the Thriving Through Being course, and it's really good. It's really interesting. There's a lot of sort of hit pause and reflect moments, which I really enjoy. And it's all about this. And I think that it's, I don't think anyone listening here, they don't come to this podcast because they don't agree with this. And it's this like investment in time, which I think is important because it'll make you better, and it'll make coaching more fulfilling and get you more in touch with your athletes and your why and all that sort of stuff. And I'll end it with in your course, you have a Dawn Staley quote, the USA and NCAA champion basketball coach and former player. My goal is always to decrease the amount of time it takes for us to make a connection, because that's where it all starts. If there were ever a secret to being a great coach, that's it, the connection. And this is what it's all about. This whole conversation is about how do I forge a better connection. So any last thoughts? I'll give you the last word.
That's it. I'll just reiterate, that's a skill that can be learned. That was a really, really good point, and something we don't always recognize. But that's all the work we're doing is about giving you tools to build that skill.
Love it. Lauren, thanks for being on The Way Champions.
Thanks so much for having me.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you to Dr. Lauren McHenry. Thank you for all that insight. Again, UnitedSoccerCoaches.org, college coach credentialing. Also, McHenry Mental Performance.com is her website, and you can check out this Thriving Through Being course that I've gone through, which is really great. But just this idea of unconditional regard, and how do we make, just like Jerry and I talk about the river, right? How do we make athletes feel acceptance, respect, belief, engagement, and challenge? That's how you make them feel regarded. And we don't want to disregard them. We don't want to negatively regard them, or we don't want to throw conditions on that. Just this unconditional regard is the foundation and the key to connection and being a better coach. Okay. So thanks, everyone. Thank you to Sprocket Sports. Thanks to our Patreon podcast champions. And again, one more time, just if you want some bulk book orders, or go grab those books off Amazon or whatever, get those orders in soon. We'll give you a big discount and help you get these in the hands of your team or your coaching staff or whatever it is. And you just email me, john@changingthegameproject.com. Okay. So remember, your influence is never neutral. And if you can fill that influence with unconditional regard, you're going to reach more athletes, and they're going to reach their potential. Enjoy, everyone. Have a great week. We'll see you again next week.